Rain hits the window of my Boston apartment in long, slanted lines, the kind that blur the city into streaks of gray. I'm 28 now. I've learned how to live with quiet, with routine, with the kind of stability that once felt impossible. There's an envelope on my kitchen counter, thin and yellowed. The return address stamped from a nursing facility in western Massachusetts. My father's handwriting uneven, shakier than I remember. I haven't opened it yet. I already know what it is. Apologies have a weight. You can feel them before you read a single word. The rain tonight smells exactly like it did 13 years ago. October 14. Lao Tsen Ling Yi Shi Yi. I was 15. That night comes back to me not as a memory, but as a physical sensation. Cold first, then disbelief, then the sound of a door locking from the inside. You're not staying here anymore. My father's voice wasn't loud. That's what made it worse. Calm, decisive, as if he'd been waiting to say it. He stood in the doorway, porch light behind him, my shadow stretching out onto the wet concrete. He said he'd found drugs in my room, cash I couldn't explain, a second phone hidden in my backpack. I tried to answer, tried to laugh, because it was so absurd I thought it had to be a test. I didn't do that. I said, "You know I didn't." He didn't look at me. He just handed me my school bag. No jacket, no phone, no wallet. Get help somewhere else. He said, "I won't let you poison this family." Then he closed the door. The click of the lock echoed louder than the thunder. I stood there for a full minute, waiting for him to open it again, for anyone to say this was going too far. My sister's bedroom light was on upstairs. I could see it through the rain. She didn't come down, so I started walking. The plan was simple in the way only a desperate teenager's plan can be: walk to my grandmother's house. 7 miles. I'd done the distance before on a bike. I told myself it was possible. Within 20 minutes, my shoes were soaked through. My sweatshirt clung to my skin. The rain wasn't dramatic, it was relentless. Cold needles driven sideways by the wind. I remember counting streetlights, telling myself I'd rest after the next one, then the next. My fingers stopped hurting at some point, which I didn't realize was a bad sign. Cars passed without slowing. Houses glowed warm behind curtains. Life went on, unaware that I was shrinking inside my own body. The last clear thought I had was this: he thinks he solved a problem. I don't remember falling. I remember the pavement rushing up. Then nothing. When I woke up, there was a ceiling above me instead of a sky. White. Too bright. A beeping sound somewhere near my head. And a woman's voice saying, "Stay with me, kid. You're safe now." What I didn't know then, what none of us knew yet, was that the storm my father pushed me into would end up exposing everything he was so desperate not to see. People like to believe moments like that come out of nowhere. One night, one argument, one bad decision, a sudden explosion. That's comforting. It means no one missed the warning signs. But families don't break in a single night. They fracture slowly, quietly, hairline cracks, spreading under pressure until something finally gives. My mother was the first fault line. She died when I was 12. Breast cancer. The kind everyone said she'd fight bravely, as if courage alone could negotiate with cells that didn't care. I remember hospital rooms that smelled like antiseptic and overcooked coffee. The sound of machines breathing for her when she was too tired to do it herself. Before she got sick, our house had a rhythm. Not perfect, but warm. My mother noticed things: unfinished homework, bruised knees, moods that lingered too long. She asked questions and waited for real answers. After she was gone, the house felt hollowed out. My father didn't become cruel overnight. He became absent, which, in some ways, was worse. He worked longer hours, ate dinner in silence, slept in front of the television instead of in the bedroom they used to share. Grief drained him, and no one stepped in to refill what was lost. Someone had to fill the space. My older sister did. She was 4 years ahead of me, old enough to understand what death meant, old enough to perform strength convincingly. Teachers praised her for being so mature. Neighbors brought casseroles and told her how proud they were. My father leaned on her in ways he never leaned on me. She paid bills with him, sat beside him at meetings, answered questions meant for adults, and she learned something early: admiration is a currency. I, on the other hand, became noise. I wasn't failing out of school. I wasn't acting out. I was just inconvenient. A reminder that my father still had a child to raise when he barely had the energy to breathe. When he looked at me, I saw calculation instead of care. Time, effort, risk. Somewhere along the way, the story formed without my consent. My sister was responsible, reliable, the one holding the family together. I was the problem waiting to happen. It started small. A permission slip that never made it home. A missed parent-teacher meeting I got blamed for not mentioning. Homework assignments that went missing from my backpack after I'd finished them. Why are your grades slipping? My father would ask. They weren't. Not really. But explaining required effort, and effort was in short supply. My sister had a way of sighing softly during these conversations, never accusing me outright, just concerned, thoughtful. I'm worried about him, she'd say. He's been different lately. Different became dangerous. Dangerous became suspicious. If something went wrong in the house, a missing $20 bill, a broken lamp, a tense phone call, eyes turned toward me by default. Not because there was evidence, because there was expectation. I learned to keep my head down, to speak carefully, to rehearse explanations before I needed them. The irony is, I was trying harder than ever to be invisible. But invisibility isn't the same as safety. By the time I was 14, my reputation inside my own family was already written. Moody, secretive, unreliable. My sister wore concern like a mask that no one thought to question. She knew when to defend me just enough to look fair, when to step back and let suspicion grow on its own. And my father, exhausted, grieving, desperate for stability, wanted to believe her, needed to believe her. Believing her meant the chaos had a source, that it wasn't random, that it could be controlled. It meant the problem was me. When he later told himself he was protecting the family, he wasn't lying. He had just accepted a version of reality that made survival easier. By the time the storm came, the verdict had already been decided. All that night did was make it official. My father remarried less than a year after my mother's funeral. People said it was too fast. Others said it was understandable. Grief makes people afraid of empty rooms. My father framed it as stability, routine, a woman who could help keep things together. Her name was Dolores. She moved into the house like someone stepping onto a stage she'd already rehearsed for. Polite smiles, soft voice, compliments that landed just slightly off. Like she was reading from a script she didn't fully understand but knew how to deliver convincingly. From the beginning, she treated my sister like an ally. They cooked together, whispered at the kitchen counter, shared looks I wasn't meant to interpret. Dolores called her so capable, so grounded. Such a blessing after everything we'd been through. I became background noise. Dinner conversations flowed around me instead of including me. If I spoke, Dolores would nod kindly and then redirect the topic back to my sister. If I stayed quiet, it was noted as evidence of my withdrawal. You should try harder to engage, my father would say later, as if I hadn't spent the whole meal trying to exist without irritating anyone. The alliance between them was subtle but airtight. Dolores didn't openly dislike me. That would have required effort. Instead, she questioned me. Are you sure that's what happened? Your tone feels defensive. I just want what's best for you. Every sentence sounded reasonable, caring, even, and every one of them placed me just slightly outside the circle. My sister learned quickly how to use this new dynamic. When she praised Dolores, Dolores glowed. When Dolores echoed her concerns, my father listened. When my sister framed something as worry instead of accusation, it stuck. I was always reacting. They were always narrating. The real shift happened when my father started talking about money. My mother had left something behind, something she'd arranged quietly. Before the treatments got worse, a trust fund set up in my name. Not enormous, not life-changing, but significant. just over $60,000, meant for education and early adulthood. The terms were clear. I'd gain access in stages. Starting at 18, the trustee was my grandmother. The fund was protected unless I was declared unfit to manage it. At 15, I didn't fully understand what that meant. I just knew my sister suddenly asked a lot of questions. What would you do with that kind of money? Do you ever worry you'd mess it up? Dad says people our age aren't mature enough to handle stuff like that. She said these things casually, thoughtfully, like she was helping me think ahead. But I noticed the way her eyes lingered whenever the fund came up. The way she'd glance at Dolores, then at my father, as if checking alignment. By then, my sister had burned through most of her own savings. College expenses, credit cards, a boyfriend who always seemed to need help. She never said she wanted my money. She didn't have to. All she had to do was make sure I never looked capable of keeping it. The house began to feel like a place where my actions were interpreted instead of understood. If I was quiet, I was hiding something. If I defended myself, I was aggressive. If I forgot something, it was proof. My sister stayed immaculate. Honor roll, volunteer hours, responsible daughter. Dolores praised her constantly, reinforcing the contrast. Why can't you be more like your sister? My father asked once. Not angrily, but tired, worn down. I didn't answer. I was afraid that if I did, it would only make things worse. That's the thing about being cast as the outsider. You start monitoring yourself constantly. Your posture, your tone, your silence. You live one misstep away from confirming what everyone already believes. Meanwhile, my sister grew bolder. She started correcting me in front of others, rewriting conversations, expressing concern about my behavior to relatives, teachers. Dolores, I think he's overwhelmed, she'd say. He doesn't cope well with pressure. She made it sound compassionate. By the time I realized she wasn't just protecting herself, but positioning herself, it was too late. The narrative had hardened. Roles had been assigned. Golden child, problem child, protector, threat. And the trust fund, my mother's last act of care, had become something else entirely. Not a safety net, a target. There's a difference between suspicion and certainty. Suspicion asks questions. Certainty stops listening. By the fall I turned 15. My family had crossed that line without telling me. I didn't know there were legal phrases being spoken about me behind closed doors. Words like capacity, risk, intervention. I didn't know my sister had learned the exact clause in my mother's trust that could reroute the money if I were declared unable to manage my own affairs. What I knew was simpler. The house no longer felt neutral. Every drawer felt searched. Every conversation felt rehearsed. Dolores watched me the way people watch a glass they expect to shatter. Alert, patient, already convinced of the outcome. My sister's boyfriend, Gordon, started appearing more often. He was older, polished in the way people get when they're good at lying calmly. He called my father sir and shook his hand like they were equals. I stayed out of his way. Later, I'd learned Gordon had debts, bad ones, and that my sister had promised him things she didn't yet have. Promises need plans. The plan came together in pieces small enough to hide. First, money. A few 20s slipped into the back of my dresser drawer. Then more, folded carefully. Enough to look intentional. Enough to raise eyebrows. Then pills. Prescription bottles I didn't recognize. Painkillers. A label scraped just enough to be illegible. Hidden inside an old sneaker under my bed. Finally, the phone. A cheap burner. No contacts. No case. Slid into the lining of my backpack where the seam had come loose months earlier. I didn't feel it there. Didn't know to look. They were patient, letting time do the work. My sister started voicing concern more openly. Not fear. Fear would have sounded hysterical. She chose disappointment. He's lying to us, she told my father one night. I don't think he means to, but I think he's spiraling. Dolores nodded. I've noticed the same signs. Signs, not evidence. When my father finally confronted me, It wasn't a conversation. It was a conclusion. He asked me to open my drawers, my bag, my closet. His hands shook as he searched, not with doubt, but with dread. When he found what they'd planted, his face collapsed inward, relief and horror tangled together. Why, he asked me. Not is this true, just why. I didn't know how to answer a question built on a lie. I told him I didn't know where any of it came from. I said he could check my school, my teachers, my records. I said I'd take a test. Any test. He didn't hear it, because certainty had already settled in. And certainty is comforting when you're exhausted. Dolores suggested professional help. My sister cried quietly, saying she was scared for me. Gordon stayed silent, which somehow made him seem credible. I was sent to my room while they talked downstairs. The walls carried their voices in fragments. Words floated up through the vents. Facility. Temporary. For his own good. My mother's trust fund was never mentioned aloud. It didn't need to be. Everyone in that room understood what would happen next if the story held. By the time my father came back upstairs, his mind was made up. He told me to pack a bag. Said we'd figure out placement in the morning. Said it would all be easier if I cooperated. I asked him to call my grandmother. He refused. I asked him to wait until daylight. He shook his head. That night, the storm arrived, like punctuation, and my father, armed with false evidence, reinforced by the people he trusted most, didn't hesitate. The verdict had been written long before I ever stepped onto the porch. The rain just made the sentence feel final. Cold doesn't announce itself all at once. It creeps. It steals heat the way exhaustion steals hope quietly, until something vital shuts down. By the time my body gave up, my mind had already started drifting. I don't remember how long I walked after leaving the house. Time dissolved into sensation rain on my face, water sloshing in my shoes, the strange heaviness in my legs that made each step feel borrowed. I remember thinking I shouldn't sit down. That sitting down meant stopping. That stopping meant something I couldn't name but instinctively feared. The street I collapsed on wasn't dramatic. No bridge. No highway. Just a residential road with bare trees clawing at the sky. A place people passed every day without looking twice. My knees hit first, then my hands. The cold felt distant by then, like it belonged to someone else. I woke to warmth. Not comfort warmth. Rough blankets. A sharp smell that cut through the fog in my head. My teeth were chattering so hard it hurt. A woman's face hovered above me. Late 50s. Maybe early 60s. Hair pulled back in a practical knot. Eyes alert. Not panicked. Don't try to move, she said firmly. You're hypothermic. Her name was Irene. She'd been driving home from a late shift when she saw something in the road that didn't make sense at first. A shape that was wrong. Too still. Too small to be debris. She wrapped me in her own coat. Called for help. Stayed with me. Talking the entire time to keep me conscious. At the hospital, lights replaced rain. Beeping machines replaced wind. Someone cut my clothes away. Someone else kept asking my name, my age, my address. When they asked who to call, I didn't answer. Irene did. She didn't know me, didn't know me anything. But she stayed. Long enough to explain what she'd seen. Long enough for the questions to start. Hospitals are mandatory reporters. Hypothermia in a minor triggers protocols, whether families like it or not. Within hours, everything my father had tried to contain spilled outward. Police officers asked how I ended up outside at night. Child Protective Services asked about home. A social worker asked why no missing person report had been filed. When my grandmother arrived, the room changed. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She looked at me, pale and shaking under hospital blankets. And then she looked at the adults around her. And something shifted. She demanded records. Demanded timelines. Demanded explanations that went beyond he was difficult and we were trying to help. Emergency custody was granted that night. Not because my grandmother begged, but because the facts spoke loudly enough on their own. I was discharged into her care 2 days later. Weak, bruised, wrapped in borrowed clothes. My father didn't come. He sent a message through a caseworker instead. Said he needed space. Said he hoped I'd get the help I needed. The house I'd been thrown out of was no longer allowed to take me back. The power had changed hands. And for the first time since my mother died, adults were asking questions that required real answers. Irene visited once before I was released. She brought a book and an awkward smile. I used to work for CPS. She said, I know what I saw. She didn't promise justice. She didn't offer comfort she couldn't guarantee. She just told the truth. And that turned out to be enough to start unraveling everything. Once questions start being asked by people who don't need your approval, lies lose their shelter. The investigation didn't feel dramatic at first. No shouting. No confrontations. Just paperwork. Timelines. And quiet persistence. Clipboards instead of accusations. Calm voices instead of anger. That's what made it terrifying for the people who had something to hide. My grandmother's house became the temporary center of gravity. CPS workers came and went. Police officers sat at her dining table, with folders open, pens tapping thoughtfully as they listened. They asked me to tell my story again. Slowly. In order. Without interruption. For the first time. No one rushed me. They compared what I said to school attendance records. Grades. Counselor notes. Emails from teachers describing me as withdrawn but consistent. Academically stable. No behavioral flags. The version of me my family had described didn't exist on paper. Then came the financial trail. My grandmother requested bank statements my father had never bothered to look at closely. Years of small withdrawals. Transfers that didn't align with household expenses. Cash pulled in amounts just under thresholds that would trigger scrutiny. Nearly $20,000 missing. Not from me. From my father. The ATM footage sealed it. A detective sat beside me one afternoon and turned the screen so I could see. Granny video. Time-stamped. My sister at the machine. Alone. Repeating the same pattern over months. Withdraw. Look around. Leave. The camera didn't lie. It never raises its voice. It just remembers. When confronted, my sister cried. Said she'd meant to pay it back. Blamed stress. Blamed grief. Blamed Gordon. That opened another door. Gordon's prescription records didn't match the pills found in my room. Different pharmacy. Different doctor. His name. His dosage. His habit. The burner phone took longer. Forensics pulled data even after attempts to wipe it. Photos. Short videos. Angles that made my stomach turn. Someone had recorded my room while I was at school. Close-ups of the planted items. Evidence being created. Not discovered. The metadata didn't point to me. It pointed to Gordon's car. My father was interviewed last. By then, the ground under him was already gone. He tried to explain. Tried to justify. Said he'd been afraid. Said he thought he was acting fast to prevent something worse. The detective asked a single question. Why didn't you verify any of it? My father didn't answer. Because the truth was simpler and more damning than anything else. Verification would have required doubt. And doubt would have meant questioning the people he'd chosen to trust. When Gordon realized the evidence was stacking too neatly to outrun, he did what desperate people often do. He talked. Not out of remorse. Out of self-preservation. He admitted my sister had come to him with the trust fund clause. That she'd said all they needed was to make me look unstable long enough. That once I was declared unfit, the money would be rerouted through family control. He admitted to helping stage the scene. To buying the burner phone. To slipping the pills into my room. He said my name like it was a detail. Not a person. By the time formal charges were filed, my sister had stopped crying. She went quiet instead. Cold. Calculating. As if she were still searching for a way to bend the narrative back in her favor. But stories collapse when too many people hold copies of the truth. CPS recommended permanent guardianship for my grandmother. The police moved forward with fraud and false accusation charges. My father was informed that custody was no longer his decision to make. I watched all of this from the edges. Wrapped in blankets. Drinking tea, I barely tasted. Justice didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy. Because every revelation confirmed something worse than betrayal. I had never been mistaken. I had been targeted. Courtrooms don't feel like the movies. There's no music, no dramatic pauses, just fluorescent lights, hard benches, and the low hum of people waiting for their turn to be judged. I was 16 when we stood before a judge. I wore a borrowed jacket that didn't quite fit my shoulders. My grandmother sat beside me, spine straight, hands folded, calm in a way that felt deliberate, like she was holding the room steady by sheer will. My sister sat on the other side. She didn't look at me. Gordon did. Not with guilt, with calculation, the look of someone measuring exits even when the doors are already closed. When he was called to testify, the shift was immediate. His lawyer whispered urgently. The prosecutor didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Under oath, Gordon chose himself. He admitted to everything he could no longer deny. The burner phone, the staged photos, the pills, the plan to trigger a declaration of incapacity so the trust could be redirected. He said my sister's name out loud in open court. The sound of it landed like a crack in glass. My sister's attorney tried to object, tried to reframe, tried to suggest coercion, confusion, emotional instability. The judge listened, took notes, asked questions that cut cleanly through the noise. When my sister finally spoke, her voice was steady but thin. She said she'd been trying to protect the family, that she'd been under pressure, that she hadn't thought things would go so far. The judge asked her why the money withdrawals predated any concern about me. She didn't answer. Dolores was called next. For the first time, she looked unsure. Her carefully neutral expressions faltered as she was asked about what she'd seen, what she'd assumed, and what she'd chosen not to verify. I trusted her, she said quietly, meaning my sister. The judge nodded once, then asked if trust replaced responsibility when a child's safety was at stake. Dolores lowered her eyes. My father was last. He looked smaller than I remembered. Older. Not broken, just exposed. He said he'd made a mistake. Said he'd been afraid of losing control. Said he believed he was acting in my best interest. The judge asked him why he hadn't called my grandmother. Why he hadn't involved school counselors. Why he'd locked the door. Silence stretched. In the end, the rulings were clear. My sister was found responsible for fraud and false accusation. Sentencing would follow. My father was stripped of guardianship. Emergency custody became permanent. The gavel came down without ceremony. No one looked at me. And that was exactly how it should have been. Moving into my grandmother's house felt less like an escape and more like learning how to breathe again. Her place was small, quiet. Everything had a designated spot. From the teacups in the cabinet to the shoes by the door. Predictability wasn't boring there. It was healing. After years of living inside tension, routine felt like mercy. I started at a new school 2 weeks later. No one knew my history. No whispered labels. No inherited expectations. Teachers asked my name and waited for my answer, instead of assuming they already knew who I was. I didn't talk much at first. Therapy helped with that. The sessions were slow. Sometimes frustrating. I learned words for things I'd only felt before: hypervigilance, internalized blame, conditioned silence. Naming them didn't erase them, but it gave me distance, perspective. For the first time, adults corrected themselves when they were wrong. That alone rewired something in me. My grandmother never pushed for forgiveness. She didn't poison me with bitterness either. She let facts stand where they were and focused on what came next. My father faded quickly. He tried once, early on, to call. Left a voicemail about wanting to check in. My grandmother asked me what I wanted to do. I chose not to respond. Karen, my sister, lost more than the case. Word travels fast in small communities. Employers stopped calling her back. Friends stopped defending her. People didn't confront her. They just stepped away. The silence she'd once weaponized turned inward. Dolores stayed with my father for a while. Long enough for the damage to settle, long enough to realize she'd built a life on selective blindness. When she left, it wasn't dramatic, just final. I graduated high school quietly. No speeches, no announcements, just a name called, a diploma handed over, and my grandmother's steady applause from the audience. College came next, then work, then something like confidence, not the loud kind, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. I learned how to set boundaries without apologizing, how to leave rooms that felt wrong, how to trust my own version of events. The trust fund remained untouched until I was legally allowed access. My grandmother never mentioned it unless I did. When I finally used part of it for tuition, for rent it felt like a continuation of my mother's care, not a prize. The past didn't disappear, but it stopped chasing me. By the time the letter arrived, my life no longer had sharp edges. I had a career I'd built carefully, one decision at a time, work that trusted me with responsibility instead of monitoring me for failure. A small circle of people who knew my history without defining me by it. A future that felt intentional. The envelope waited on my counter for 3 days before I opened it. My father wrote that he was sick, that his health was failing faster than expected, that the doctors had moved him to long-term care. He wrote that he thought about me often, that he was sorry. The words sat on the page like an object I could pick up and examine from all sides. Sorry for what? Exactly. He didn't ask for forgiveness. Not directly. He asked to see me. Said he didn't expect anything. Said he understood if I said no. I read the letter twice, then a third time, 13 years earlier. I would have gone immediately, out of fear, out of habit, out of the need to prove something. Now, I waited. I talked it through with the people I trusted, not to get permission, but to hear my own reasoning out loud. I wasn't angry anymore. That surprised me. Anger requires energy. I'd spent mine elsewhere. What I felt instead was clarity. I didn't owe him closure, but I could choose it for myself. I called the facility the following week. The nurse sounded relieved, as if she'd been fielding questions on his behalf. We scheduled a short visit. No expectations. No reconciliation arc. Just a conversation. The night before I went, it rained again. Softer this time. Steadier. I slept without dreams. When morning came, I wasn't nervous. I was ready. The nursing home smelled faintly of disinfectant and overcooked vegetables. A neutral place. It stripped of the personal details that once made a house feel like a home. My father sat by the window when I walked in. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not frail. Exactly, but diminished. Like someone whose world had narrowed to the size of the room he occupied. He stood when he saw me, then hesitated, unsure whether he was allowed to. I nodded once. He sat back down. We talked about ordinary things at first. The weather, the drive, the routine of the place. He told me his days were quiet, that he spent a lot of time thinking. Eventually, silence did what it always does. It forced honesty. I was wrong, he said. Not defensively. Not urgently. Just tired. I didn't protect you. I chose the easiest explanation. I didn't interrupt him. He said he'd cut contact with my sister years ago. That after the trial, he realized seeing her meant reliving the choice he'd made. He didn't ask me to reconcile with her. He didn't defend her. That mattered. I told him I wasn't there to reopen the past. That I had a life now. One I'd built without his help or his approval. I forgive you, I said, and then I added the part that mattered. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And it doesn't mean starting over. He closed his eyes, nodded, accepted it. We didn't hug. When I stood to leave, he thanked me for coming, not for forgiving him, for showing up. Outside, the air felt clean, cool. The sky was heavy with clouds, but the storm hadn't broken. As I drove away, I realized something quietly profound. The night he pushed me into the rain, he thought he was ending a problem. What he actually did was remove himself from the center of my life. That storm didn't destroy me. It redirected me. Some stories end with revenge. Others end with reconciliation. This one ends with boundaries. If you've ever been misjudged by the people who were supposed to protect you, know, this survival doesn't have to look dramatic to be powerful. Sometimes the greatest victory is building a life so solid that the past can't shake it anymore. If this story resonated with you, Consider subscribing and exploring more stories about truth, resilience, and quiet justice. You're not alone, and your story isn't over. This story is a work of fiction created for storytelling and discussion purposes only. All names, locations, events, and details have been altered or invented. Any resemblance to real individuals or situations is purely coincidental and unintentional.